Well, we've made it to the end of BlackHat yet again. And as always, it was full of useful information, challenging discussions, and a look at all the news and trends that's happening in the world of adversaries. But if you missed BlackHat 25 or you were stuck in the business hole the whole time, then don't worry, because I've compiled what I think are the most interesting and challenging takeaways from this year's BlackHat. Now I want to cover 4 topics here, and the first one is what is trending in the world of adversaries, and of course that's going to focus on supply chain attacks, but interesting what we've taken away from the briefings. We're also going to take a look into the fascinating and wonderful world of policy and compliance. Now this may not be everyone's favorite topics, but we'll break this down into some key takeaways of what's happening in policy around cybersecurity. We're going to dive into artificial intelligence and review if this is helping or hurting cybersecurity. And of course, we are going to be looking at Ukraine. What is happening in the cyber war, the largest cyber war that we've faced yet. So let's start off by talking about supply chain attacks. Now, you will know that this has been out of the forefront of everyone's mind in the last couple of years. So it should be no surprise that this has come up front and center in BlackHat 25. But there was actually some interesting developments from researchers and briefings about specifically where in the supply chain attackers are targeting. Now, the supply chain covers really all elements of what goes into building software, from its dependencies, the build lifecycle, the testing process, and the deployment process. And what we've found from these briefings is that attackers are really targeting and trending towards attacking that build process, specifically by targeting developers. Developers need access to lots of the tools to build our software. The problem is that these accounts, the developer accounts, should be restricted and limited in their ability, especially when we're talking about accessing the CI/CD pipeline, when we're talking about accessing secrets, and when we're talking about the build controls. What adversaries and researchers alike have discovered is that it is quite easy to not only hijack or compromise a developer account, but to then leapfrog, elevate privileges, and move laterally to be able to gain more administrative access and do much more damage. The first briefing that I want to talk about is RCE-as-a-Service, lessons from 5 years of real-world CI/CD pipeline compromise attack. Now, this was actually done by Victor Gazdag and Ian Smart. Victor, I'm sorry if I got your name wrong. But these guys are both from the NCC, and they discussed exactly how they are able to compromise the CI/CD pipelines in multiple different companies using multiple different methods. If you're not familiar with the CI/CD pipeline, this is basically an automated environment that helps you kind of test, build, and deploy your application. You can do all sorts of things in the CI/CD pipeline, and full control over this should be limited to very few people and administrators. But what this presentation showed is actually it's very easy to compromise and poison the CI/CD pipeline from developer accounts. Now, developers need to access the CI/CD pipeline and sometimes interact with it, but they shouldn't have full permissions over it. They shouldn't be able to disrupt its lifecycle. Now, why is that? Well, Smart said it himself. We need to assume that all of our developers are malicious. Now, this doesn't mean that we need to think that all of our developers have malicious intent and we should fire them all. No, this just means that we should assume the posture that all developers potentially could be malicious and we should act on security as such. But they showed that even companies that thought they had fantastic security were actually really lacking. They could alter the YAML files that interacted with CI/CD pipelines, inject malicious packages, which basically allowed them to dump information, and through various different methods were able to elevate privileges and gain access that they shouldn't have, all from a developer account. one very compelling example, which is looking at basics first, not forgetting that the basics are the basics of security. Show that developers have access to development secrets, development credentials, but just by changing dev to prod, they were able to dump out the production credentials and every developer would have access to them. So this is one area to show that we're not doing enough in protecting developer accounts. Now, the other area, which was from a different briefing, really looks at your source code and how your source code is a massive target in a supply chain attack, and increasingly so. And again, it's developer accounts that are being targeted. Specifically in this case, Brett Hawkins came up with a fantastic product. Well, fantastic depending on where you sit in your defense or attack posture, called SCM Kit. It's Source Code Management Kit. Now, there was a couple of sessions by Brett on this tool, but effectively what this tool looks at is how if an adversary can gain access, again, to a developer account on source code, how they can use the information and harnesses, and specifically how they can use the APIs of common version control systems like GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab to really become admins, access repositories they shouldn't have, poison deployment lifecycles, poison applications, and really kind of take control of that build in the software supply chain. Now, I was fortunate enough to track down Brett Hawkins in the hallways and ask him a couple of questions about SCM Kit and why it's so important that we need to focus on source code, code repositories in protecting our application.
Yeah, so my talk focused on abusing source code management systems. So performing a number of different attacks within source code management systems, like doing reconnaissance, privilege escalation, and persistence. These systems are vital to organizations, and they just need more attention, right? So attackers are really focusing on these systems more, and as such, I wanted to create this research and bring more awareness to these systems and defending them. Yeah, so kind of in terms of sensitive information within those systems, making sure that there's, for code commits, make sure that there's a kind of approvers in place for when code commits are done, provide security awareness training also to developers so they know, hey, we shouldn't be committing code secrets. On the other side of it, in terms of the actual attack scenarios abusing these systems, I've got some different logging that can be in place for detecting these different activities, whether it's persistence or privilege escalation as well. And then lastly, just making sure, like with the alternative mechanisms to authenticate to these systems, like access tokens and SSH keys, treat these like passwords and force these keys to expire and don't let them live on forever.
So what is the kind of general theme of all of these talks that we've just discussed? Well, it's that the conversation of supply chain attacks are moving. We used to think a lot on dependencies and trying to poison dependencies or using type squatting, but now they're really starting to target the developer accounts, and we've seen this in some real life actions such as from Lapsus and other areas where they've actually bought access to developer accounts, to insiders. So we need to better secure our infrastructure, we need to prevent misconfigurations, and we need to adopt the posture that developers could potentially be an insider threat, and this will help us secure our supply chain. Okay, moving along, I want to talk about what was uncovered in the policy and compliance sessions at BlackHat. Now, don't click away, we'll get through this quickly, but it's actually really important that we cover this. Now, the policy sessions are usually in the smaller rooms, hidden away, and not attended by much, but it's really important. And BlackHat has this weird position where, for a moment in space and time, governance, government officials, hackers, adversaries, defenders, red teamers all get together. And we can actually discuss meaningful policy. So here's where a lot of practical information can actually come out and develop. So really important that we focus at least a little bit on policy before moving on. Now, policy was discussed throughout the whole process of BlackHat, even from the keynote of Chris Kurbs, who was the first director of CISA. Now, Chris actually said that the government has struggled to balance market intervention regulations with the desire of a capitalist economy to allow innovation to grow. As a result, we have had an uneven application of market interventions or regulations. So we know that we're not doing very well in policy. We know that we need probably more compliance in policy, but we're not quite sure how we can implement it. And BlackHat this year was really a test for that executive order. Executive Order 14028, which came out of the White House this year. It had lots of information that we need to cover in terms of securing our software development. But one part was really picked apart at BlackHat, both as a hopeful promise and as a potential failing. Now, this was the part of the SBOM, the Software Bill of Materials. And this is of particular interest because about 6 months after the executive order came out, we were faced with Log4j. What was really interesting is that people really struggled to find out where their exposure to Log4j was throughout the year. And the SBOM was really meant to help with that. A software bill of materials is a list of all the components in your application or in your software that it is reliant on. So using this, it should be easy to identify whether or not Log4j was a component. And we had 6 months to kind of roll this out. One really interesting session about policy and the effectiveness of Executive Order 14028 was from a panel moderated by Jeff Moss, but with the Cyber Safety Review Board, and specifically Robert Silvers and Heather Atkins. Now, there was a lot here to discuss the effectiveness of what the government is doing and the newly formed Cyber Safety Review Board and what they've been working on. And one of the areas is Log4j. This board was initially set up for SolarWinds, but the first kind of adversary that they tackled, or first event that they tackled, was Log4j. And the question by Jeff Moss was posed was, did the SBOM help in Log4j? Were we able to use this tool to identify problems? And the answer wasn't so great. The board did not find stakeholders that were able to use the SBOM successfully. Now, this can come down to a failure that perhaps this policy wasn't as good as we thought it was going to be, but also come down to the fact that perhaps it's too soon and we need more time. What was clear is that the SBOM is needed, and that from Log4j, had SBOM been implemented the way that it had envisioned, it could have great impact. So we can see that perhaps this means more enforcement and more rapid deployment of these policies. How do we do that? Well, the main avenues was that the government needs to be better at enforcing these policies. The government is one of the biggest purchasers of software on the planet, and they have failed in implementing the recommendations that they have put in place. So it hasn't become a priority for vendors. So that is one area where we really need to push forward on policy. So I think we can see that from this, there's going to be much stricter implementations of these policies by government themselves, particularly US government. Now, moving away from that executive order, there's one other really interesting area which needs policy intervention from security, at least from what I could gather from the briefings, and that's the area of security vulnerability research, or more commonly known as bug bounty or bug bounty programs. Now, this is a very important ecosystem in security. The bug bounty programs actually played a huge part in trying to tackle the Log4j problem because we needed to call on external resources, and there was an army waiting to do this. So this has become a really important part of the ecosystem. Now, this was discussed at length in a number of briefings, but there's a couple of important ones. So one from Stuart Scott, who's part of Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative, a bit of a mouthful, but he did a session on the policies that are really going to affect these bug bounty programs, and what he focused on was the health of the security researcher ecosystem. It's incredibly important, but how fragile is it? Now, Stuart himself actually said that we need to consider vulnerability research at scale as a supplier, a community that has to be invested in and given guardrails and protection. And to summarize Stuart Scott's session, what he really found was that this ecosystem is taken too far for granted, and particularly its reliability, and that not enough investment, particularly in policy, has actually gone into making sure that we can harvest and grow this community, as it's become such an important part of the environmental landscape. Now, this was echoed in a number of talks, but there's another specific one that I want to quickly mention by Dylan Alvery and Whitney Merrill. which focused on the type of data that these security vulnerability researchers or bug hunters actually uncover. Now, this concerns policy not from government, but also internal policies of organizations within their bug bounty programs. It's very common that in a bug bounty program, you cannot access external users' data. You can only access your own data. You need to try and prove a bug using your personal data. The problem is this almost is never completely plausible. And if you're doing something like blind cross-site scripting, as Ellery said, then this can actually cause problems because you can accidentally get users' data. That can be part of the vulnerability. So bug bounties are often working against the policies, which could have implications. So the talk focused on what to do if bug bounty kind of gather information, if they should be in trouble. But the point is that these policies are put in place that don't provide adequate protection for this ecosystem. Now, all of this policy can be summed up by the fact that we're becoming over-reliant on certain checklists and we're walking away from performance outcomes. So this was reiterated by Chris Curbs in his keynote speech, where he said that even when government does regulate, they don't do it right. They don't do it well. We see an over-reliance on checklist and compliance rather than performance-based outcomes. And when we're talking about these security vulnerabilities, this is exactly what we're talking about. They're performance-based outcomes of keeping this ecosystem healthy because we rely on it. Now, moving on, I want to quickly talk about artificial intelligence because we all love a buzzword, and boy, this one got thrown around a lot. So if you're in the business hall, you would think that cybersecurity and artificial intelligence is one and the same. It is on every single cool vendor's posters. Now, I work for a vendor. I was in the vendor hall for part of it too. So no, not hamming on vendors, but from the briefings, where can we actually sit in AI in cybersecurity? And there were some interesting findings. Now, in his session, Edward Wu, who's a senior principal data scientist, actually said that despite the hype, AI has not been the cybersecurity silver bullet that many had hoped it would be. Cyber defenders are still faced with increasingly sophisticated attacks. So what does all this mean? Well, what the briefings really discussed is that there are two elements of AI. There is what is being effective, which is replacing mundane tasks, and then there's what is not being effective, which is trying to replace that highly skilled threat detection. And that is still really lacking. And in a few briefings, what we also really could uncover is actually how AI is potentially hurting cybersecurity. And this was really interesting. So there was a talk called In Need of Peer Review, Vulnerable Code Contributions by GitHub Copilot. Now, this was one of my favorite talks, and not just because the presenters were also from New Zealand. But this really looked at whether or not AI-based tools designed to help developers like GitHub Copilot or other tools out there to help to create code suggestions, are they suggesting secure code or vulnerable code? Now, as you might guess, the answer is probably going to be vulnerable code. Their findings presented that about 40% of applications created by these AI tools contain vulnerabilities within the source code. So that's quite a large amount, but it actually found some really interesting information. And that is that this artificial intelligence is more like artificial guessing in the sense that Copilot, for example, uses a huge database and it's trying to find suggestions of code based on that database. If you're writing insecure code to start with, it's going to suggest insecure code to you. So we have to look at exactly when we're going to use these tools. Now, I was lucky enough to have a chat with one of the presenters, Benjamin Tan, and I asked him about when companies should actually consider using Copilot and these AI tools, and how should they be careful about it.
So this is a bit of a tricky question, right? Because we've used Copilot ourselves, and it actually is quite a fun tool to use, and it can really help with pretty rudimentary things. But I guess our real kind of recommendations are, make sure you've got good processes in place for general security validation, so that after code is written, that you're doing all of that backend security scanning stuff anyway. If you already do that with human developers that are flawed, then you're on the right track. Just keep doing those sorts of things. The second thing is maybe think a little bit about who in your team should be able to use this. maybe it's something where you have to be mindful that the novice developers who don't check what's going on, accepting suggestions kind of blindly. So you want to kind of watch out for that. And I guess the third thing is, just really treat it as a Copilot, as something that will kind of help you along, but is not the real director of what code you're writing. Check it and all that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Benjamin Tan, thank you so much for your time. Great talk, and really appreciate it.
Cheers.
Now, finally, my last takeaway from BlackHat. BlackHat was originally and traditionally set up as a place where organizations and government could come learn about what's happening in the world of malicious activity, what the Black Hats are up to. Well, that part still remains true, and the Black Hat activity overwhelmingly, unfortunately, is in Ukraine this year. And there was a lot of fascinating briefs about Ukraine. Now, none more so than Victor Zora, who is the chief cyber officer in Ukraine, who actually came to BlackHat to present on a few things. Now, Victor Zora actually said himself, this is perhaps the biggest challenge since World War II, and it continues to be completely new in cyberspace. Now, Victor actually joined a session from Robert Lepolsky and Anton Cheripanov, who were specifically look at Sandworm's attacks on Ukraine. Now, Sandworm is a notorious Russian-backed hacking group, and they created Industria, which caused the BlackHat in Ukraine way back in 2017. And now they looked at Industria 2, the updated version, which was unleashed on Ukraine this year. Now, this is significant because it shows a number of stories. Now, the first is a good story, is that Ukraine was able to actively defend against this attack. And this is despite Robert Lepolsky actually saying that this was the most significant cyber attack, even if unsuccessful, during the war thus far. But this shows some interesting trends. Now, if we look at some other briefings on Ukraine, specifically one from Thomas Hagel and Johan Andreas Guerrero, who actually did a detailed war on the timeline of all the attacks of Ukraine. And what was significant is that they really uncovered that we need to stop thinking about cyber war and physical war as being two different elements. They are actually connected in the same. The cyber war in Ukraine is targeting real physical assets. It's trying to disrupt supply lines, disrupt infrastructure that has a real world impact on war. We often think about it as this invisible cyber war that doesn't really do any physical harm, but the reality of what we've seen in Ukraine with Industria 2, with the DDoS attacks on infrastructure, is that it has real life implications that affect the real world. So we need to be more careful about when we're using the term cyber war, and we need to stop thinking about it as a separate domain. Thomas Hegel himself said, we keep expecting it to be its own domain of warfare, that one day we'll have a war completely online, but this isn't going to be the case. So ultimately, to summarize what is happening in Ukraine from BlackHat, the attacks are overwhelming and they have real world intentions even if they're being defended. But we need to stop pretending like it's a completely separate thing and start looking at it as a real physical threat like we would a physical attack. And the good is that Ukraine are defending well, but the bad is that the amount of attacks have been absolutely relentless and been on civilian targets. Luckily, Ukraine seems to have been prepared for this, but can we say the same in the rest of the world? We're looking at Ukraine, but thinking about ourselves. So we've come to the end of my BlackHat recap. I hope you found this video useful, and if you disagree or have some other key points that you would like to highlight, let me know in the comments. Let's start a discussion about what the key elements of BlackHat was this year. So I do hope that you found the video useful. I hope that you'll consider subscribing and giving me a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, or if you didn't, just for the sake of it. And I hope to see you next time. And remember, good code is secure code. Thanks, everyone.